Historian, former senior associate at the U.S. Department of Education, Dr. Dennis Cuddy, my guest today in the summertime, as you well know. Welcome back to Steel on Steel. John Lefter here with you. We kick back and we do more intense perspective pieces and backgrounders on things that you see going on, trying to explain them in a way that you can understand because data points are hard to follow. We're talking about the globalist attitudes towards President Trump, especially given his relationships with Henry Kissinger. Dennis Cuddy is author of Conspiracy and also Power Elite and the Secret Nazi Plan. So when we picked up on this, we were talking about, I'm trying to remember, we sort of left off in a midpoint here about Trump's relationship with Kissinger and how that was flowing.
My suspicion is that what people are missing, at least on the Republican and conservative side, is the tremendous amount of support that Bernie Sanders, a real socialist, had among millennials. And in 4 years and in 8 years, they will be a larger percentage of the voting population. So right now, when you have the Rush Limbaughs and others saying the Democrats are finished, I wouldn't be too sure about that. I think they'll probably be back. And one of the things that they don't seem to recognize, when I ask people, well, who are they going to have, they'll say, well, there's this person from New York or whatever. I said, you don't understand. The parties, Republican nor Democrat, they can't win without the South. Now, that doesn't mean it has to have a person from the South as a presidential candidate, but they have to appeal to the South, like a vice presidential candidate. And so when they try to do that, whether it's a Mitt Romney from Massachusetts or whatever, they come up unsuccessful. That also happened to Hillary Clinton this time. And so what you might find is they'll be back, the Democrats, sooner than expected. There might be a Hispanic on the ticket, maybe somebody from the Southwest. There might be a woman, because there still is this, we've elected the first black president. Now we need a woman. So there'll be that push. Some people say Hillary won't run because she's too old. Well, she might not. But on the other hand, she seems to be popping up again. And if she had won this time, she probably would have run for re-election. And there's nobody else this time on the horizon. So my guess is you will continue to have events that push towards the globalist desires. For example, the news media looked at that man in Portugal who was riding in, on those drones. It was like a little platform, and he was actually riding in on the drones. And they said, oh, is this the future of travel? And I immediately thought, well, is this the future of terrorism? I could just see that guy, riding in silently at night sometime to a football stadium and doing lots of damage. So you will probably have terrorist attacks. My last article I had was titled, I Was Surveilled, on News with Views. And in there I said, in the future, watch out for terrorist attack with an IED, improvised explosive device, at night. And then sure enough, you had Manchester 2 weeks later. Those types of things are going to affect people. So, the best laid plans of mice and men and so forth and so on are to some extent out of their control, and that's where the power elite can maneuver. But what they do is they don't do a frontal attack. They don't say, okay, people, submit to us. They create crises or situations so that the public actually requests them. And that's why Orwell in his book 1984 said, you're going to come to love Big Brother. Actually, Winston, the hero, said, we will never submit. He said, no, you're going to come to love Big Brother. And so that's what they do. They try to get a public reaction requesting something that the public never would have accepted before. So, yeah, you're right. There will seem to be some progress. But you have to remember what Carol Quigley, representing the power elite and their views, and Cecil Rhodes' Secret Society, the elect, said. He said, we want to get to a situation where you change parties, but not much else changes. It doesn't make any difference. You can go for Republican or Democrat or whatever. I remember the old statement of George Wallace. He said there's not a dime's worth of difference between the two. Now, philosophically, and during the campaigns, they talk, a lot of difference. But when it comes to actually doing something, not too much gets changed, and I'm afraid that's the way we're going to go. And like I said, when you're inexperienced, like Trump is, and how to maneuver through this morass, you're susceptible to the people you put around you. And when you put people in key positions like his son-in-law and Gary Cohn, who are Democrats, what kind of advice are you going to expect?
That's sort of the interesting. What was Alice Bailey's ultimate goal from her plan? And for listeners who are unfamiliar with this, I'm trying to figure out how to encapsulate Alice Bailey. First of all, she channeled all of this from her ascended master called Djwal Khol. It's a series of different booklets. They're promoted by Lucis Trust Organization, which is an NGO at the United Nations. So what was her goal?
Well, Alice Bailey was the last major person along the lines. It started with Madame Blavatsky, Helena Petrovna Blavatsky. She was succeeded by Annie Besant. They co-edited a journal called Lucifer, which they changed to the Theosophical Monthly, and then by the early 1900s, 1920, 21, Alice Bailey succeeded them, and it was originally called Lucifer Publishing, but Lucifer didn't have such a good rep as he does now on TV, on the Fox network. You know, people like Lucifer. The character there is supposed to become from hell, and he's helping the Los Angeles Police Department solve crimes with his mistress and everything else, and they're trying to, reshape his image so he's not such a bad guy. So anyway, her goal was, as I said, the World Federation of Nations, which would be socialist, and it would come about, she said in a book she did around 1933, it would come about by 2025. They're very much into astrological things. She was, when Alice died around 1950, her husband married a woman named Mary Bailey, and she would continue with their main organizations called World Goodwill, the Arcane School, and Triangles. And then on top of that, the new group of World Servers, they formed in late, around 1930-ish, and they believe that Sagittarius rules Washington, sort of an astrological thing. But they were very, very active. As you said, as Lucis Trust, they were an NGO and actually managed the UN's meditation room for a long time. They're very much accepted. And the way that shows up into practical policies is that Robert Mueller, while Secretary Generals, Kurt Waldheim and others would come and go, Robert Mueller was an assistant Secretary General for like 5 or 6 decades, and he developed these schools all over the world. And he said his schools, the Robert Mueller schools, were based on the underlying teachings of Alice Bailey and her ascended master. I call them descended demons, ascended masters, especially Schmalkohl, but there was also Master Moyer and Kudhumi, and she had his proteges. One was with the Mid-Continent Regional Education Lab when I was with the Reagan administration, and she later, this other one, Shirley McCune, wound up as assistant to the Washington State Secretary of Education there, and she and this Norma Milanovic wrote a book, The Light Will Set You Free, which was pure Alice Bailey and occult and, Luciferian types of doctrines, and they would push that, that general philosophy in the schools. They're not openly like, okay, kiddies, let's all praise Lucifer and all, but by, like I said, indirection. The humanists would do that. Secular humanist Sidney Hook wrote an article in the Humanist magazine, said we're going to get these Christians by indirection, meaning they wouldn't say, okay, down with Christ, but they would promote things like evolution, so we've all evolved, we're just higher forms of animals, we don't have souls, and so forth and so on. And so they would do that, and they would have cooperation with Brock Chisholm at the beginning of the World Health Organization. He was the head of it in 1946. He'd been put there by Alger Hiss, and in February 1946 issue of the journal Psychiatry, he said the trouble with the world today is that children are taught right and wrong by their parents and priests and pastors and so forth, and we got to get rid of that. So you have all of these global influences corrupting our values, music, dance, the culture. Like Gramsci said, forget this bloody revolution stuff. We'll just take over the culture. And as you said, you have various schools. You have the Frankfurt School and then the Leipzig School as well. Both of those schools had particular people. Theodore Adorno, his job was music, and then the Beatles would pick up, with the fractious music and a sort of syncopated rhythm. And Dmitri Tiomkin, I remember, was a famous conductor, and he called it the anapestic rhythm, which sort of throws the mind off. And, they're very, very sophisticated and very, very persuasive as to how they will control people. I mentioned before about they would quicken the tempo of human life, like Orwell's Agent O'Brien told the hero Winston. And just by quickening the tempo of human life, you change everything, because people no longer have time to calmly reflect and analyze, critically examine things. They're reduced in time to having to make decisions based upon emotional responses. And these people know what they're doing. Their emotional response can be more easily manipulated, and they know how to do that. And when you have to make a quick decision, it's often based on an impulse, which can be controlled like Pavlov and the dog, stimulus response. You got to do it quickly. You don't even think about it, and you don't really care about the future consequences. It's only now that's important. They understand all of these things, but the public doesn't. The public doesn't know that it's being manipulated by these very sophisticated people.
How does this run? Because when you talk about this, a lot of times people will say, well, that's conspiracy theory. But I always distinguish between that. These are pretty what I call open rolling agendas.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. In fact, that's what H.G. Wells said. H.G. Wells was one of the original Fabian socialists, but in that 1910 stained glass window where the two founders of the Fabian Socialist Society, they're pounding the globe on an anvil and it has across the top, remolded nearer to the heart's desire, which was an old Omar Khayyam statement. You have down at the bottom, they have these treatises and essays, and the men are on the left and the women on the right, and H.G. Wells is the one thumbing his nose over to the left. But it wasn't because he disagreed with them. He just believed they should come out in the open rather than this sneaky plot, Fabian being from the general Fabius Maximus in the Roman times. And he, therefore, after he wrote his books, A New World for Old and so forth, he came out with one called The Open Conspiracy in 1928, where he says, forget this, secret stuff. Let's just come out in the open as to what we're doing. And he was fairly clear about it. And he said at the time it would involve Russia, which has a larger presence now with Putin there. And I put a lot of that in my book, Now It's the Dawning of the New Age, New World Order. He said it would be sort of a liberal socialism, a westernized socialism. And you have others. At the same time, you have Robert Hugh Benson, whose father had been the Archbishop of Canterbury, but when Robert Hugh was 1907, he had become a Catholic Monsignor. He wrote a book called Lord of the World. And in that he said the Communist Revolution would be in 1917, then 1989 would be the Western Scheme of Free Trade, 1998, Ministers of Euthanasia, like Jack Kevorkian, and this would be American socialism. So what it is a synthesis of Western capitalism and Eastern communism.
Okay, let's take a break here. Actually, let's take a breath here. Then we'll take a breath. Every time I ask you a question, Dennis, it's like taking a drink out of a fire hydrant. Dr. Dennis Cuddy is with us, former Senior Associate, U.S. Department of Education, and also instructed in at almost all levels, high school and college levels, author of many books, including Conspiracy and The Power Elite and the Secret Nazi Plan. And we shall return. We're at steelonsteel.com. I'm John Leffler. The program is Steel on Steel.